the Holy Roman Church. For centuries, it has dazzled the world with the magnificence of its rituals and the opulence of its art and architecture. In the name of Jesus, who was born in a stable, today it gathers 1.2 billion Catholics into its fold. The Catholic Church of the 21st century is a global financial power. It employs millions of people, owns vast amounts of real estate, and has investments across the planet. But today, as always, the Church's riches bring controversy. My name is John Dickey. I am a historian. I'm undertaking an investigation into the heart of the Church's finances. It will take me across 2 continents and to some very unexpected places. In the last few years alone, a stream of scandals has rocked the Catholic Church to its core. A bishop in Germany spent over 31 million euros on renovating his diocesan residence. A Vatican bank president was placed under investigation. Even the former Pope's butler got in on the action and leaked papers that showed the church hierarchy fighting over money.
I scandali finanziari avevano visto una Chiesa sulla difensiva, sotto attacco. Un Papa autenticamente riformatore come Ratzinger è stato boicottato dalla Curia, dalle lotte interne alla Curia, al punto che con le sue dimissioni sembrava aver imboccato la Chiesa veramente una discesa di credibilità, di accountability presso l'opinione pubblica non più recuperabile.
The need to put an end to the financial incompetence and wrongdoing was critical in bringing about the election of Pope Francis.
This was the most anti-establishment conclave of the last 100 years. They didn't want to repeal the teaching of Benedict XVI. What they wanted to repeal was the business management of the Vatican over the previous 8 years. They were sick to death of all of that, and they wanted to elect a reformer that they felt could ride into Rome and clean out the stables.
But the new Pope has his work cut out for him. Priests who dip into the Sunday collection, archbishops investing in a porn channel, a hidden real estate empire, accusations of money laundering and corruption, victims of sex abuse allegedly deprived of their compensation. Why is the Catholic Church plagued by financial scandal? Can the Church reconcile its money with its morals? My search for answers begins far away from the colonnade of St. Peter's Square and takes me to the heart of Europe, Slovenia, where an archdiocese went on an investment binge and caused the loss of a mind-blowing 800 million euros. Naked bodies writhing, theatrical moans and groans. It's not exactly the kind of thing you'd expect to find on a TV station owned by the Church. Hardcore pornography was exactly what was being broadcast on a TV station belonging to the Archdiocese of Maribor here in Slovenia. Local Catholics were astonished. And they were even more astonished when it became clear that this was just the beginning of the scandal affecting their church. 3 bishops removed from their posts, a priest exiled to an Austrian monastery, a diocese on the brink of bankruptcy. This is the bitter ending of a story that began in 1991 when the country shook off communism and gained its independence. In Maribor, the church embraced capitalism and took a reckless plunge into the world of investments.
The Church of Maribor started its business around 2 decades ago when Slovenia ended its communist regime. Public companies were privatized and people received certificates which they could invest in stock options. So the church decided they should participate in this privatization race and started collecting those certificates, mostly from believers.
In a bid to regain the influence it had lost during Slovenia's communist era, the Maribor Church attempted to emulate Italy and Austria by creating Catholic schools, like this one. But money was needed, and 60,000 Slovenian Catholics entrusted their share certificates to the diocese. Some of these certificates were worth 3,000 euros. Early profits fueled a taste for financial risk.
They bought large Slovenian companies in chemical industry, in paper industry, in telecommunication industry. They also invested abroad in large infrastructure projects, in large real estate projects. Those were very high, risky investments.
The church set up 2 investment funds, Zvon 1 and Zvon 2, Bell 1 and Bell 2 in English. Through them, it bought a harbour in Croatia, a slaughterhouse in Argentina, and shares in the oil and titanium industries.
Their strategic goals, when it came to their financial investments, were to take an important part in governing business and strategic decisions in Slovenian economy. You know what do they say? Men of money can buy men of power.
The Archdiocese's biggest and riskiest investment was a telecommunications company called T2. Yes, the one caught showing porn. T2 was supposed to install optical fibre all over Slovenia, a scheme with great potential, backed by generous bank loans. But then came the Eurozone crisis.
So basically, they took a very long-term investment, but financed it with mostly short-term bank loans. It is incredible how could they have obtained, this quantity of loans. I entered the supervisory board of the largest Slovenian bank. My impression was that personal linkages and, combined with political influence was, of course, used to obtain also financial funds at a large scale. When the financial crisis hit, the supply of finance to the Slovenian banking system from the wholesale foreign markets dried up completely. Bankruptcy was inevitable.
The collapse of Bell 1 and Bell 2 also brought the Maribor Church to the brink of ruin. It turns out that the brains behind these disastrous plans had little investment expertise. He was the treasurer for the Archdiocese, one Mirko Krashevets, a priest.
I think that incompetence of highly ranked church officials can definitely be a partial explanation of why this has happened. It is the responsibility of every owner to at least hire an expert. But I guess that, whenever you hire an expert, it means that you bring external control into your company, your holding company, your investments. And I guess that getting external control, being transparent, was something they deliberately decided not to have.
The Vatican finally found out what was going on in Maribor in 2007, when the bishop asked Rome for permission to take out 2 €5 million loans. Even then, it took Pope Benedict 3 years to step in. The Archbishop and his treasurer were ousted, and Father Loitzi Zwickel was sent in to clean up the mess.
È una bella sfida la situazione attuale per la Chiesa a Maribor. Chiesa di Maribor non avrà altri mezzi che quelli che arriveranno dai fedeli. Avrà grandi problemi adesso perché non avrà mezzi finanziari, ma dovrà portare avanti una pastorale nonostante tutto questo. Sarà una chiesa molto dipendente dai fedeli e anche a servizio dei fedeli.
A lot of things came together to create the Maribor crisis. Incompetence, naivety, a lack of supervision, a fear of transparency, an unhealthy proximity to financial and political power, and of course more than a touch of old-fashioned greed. But Slovenia is far from being the only place where the church is beset with these same problems.
Avere di più, avere di più, avere di più. Ti porta all'idolatria. Ti distrugge il rapporto con gli altri.
When it comes to money, very little has caused the Catholic Church more headaches than the IOR, better known as the Vatican Bank. In June 2013, the arrest of a priest once more highlighted the flaws in this controversial institution. Ever since it was founded in 1942, the IOR has been used like an offshore bank right in the heart of Rome. This episode is only its latest brush with criminals and shady businessmen. The man at the centre of the story is a priest, Nunzio Scarano, although here they knew him as Father 500 Euros. This is where Monsignor Scarano lives, Salerno, 50 kilometres south of Naples. Angela Cappetta is a local journalist who has covered the story from day one.
Come mai lo chiamano Monsignor 500?
Scarano è chiamato Monsignor 500 perché lui era solito girare con banconote da 500 euro intere.
61-year-old Father 500 Euros is a former bank employee turned priest who worked in the Vatican administration. He loved hanging out with the rich and famous. In June 2013, he was arrested for trying to smuggle 20 million euros from Switzerland by private plane. In January 2014, Monsignor Scarano was charged again, this time for money laundering through his accounts at the Vatican Bank.
Come partono le indagini?
Tutto è partito da un furto denunciato da Monsignor 500 all'interno della sua abitazione, dove aveva dei quadri di ingenti valori, uno Chagall, un calco del crocifisso del Bernini, tutto per un valore che si aggirava intorno ai 5-6 milioni di euro.
Yet Father 500 Euros was not from a wealthy family. And he only earned maybe 3,000 euros a month from his job as a Vatican bookkeeper. Investigators began to suspect that something wasn't right.
Abbiamo praticamente evidenziato che ci sono una serie di società fantasma, alcune delle quali ghost perché sconosciute, altre praticamente che sono società facenti riferimento a paradisi fiscali, quindi non tracciabili dal punto di vista giuridico, una serie di versamenti periodici che assolutamente non possono essere considerati come donazioni e che vengono mascherati come donazioni, il tutto per un importo pari a circa 6 milioni e mezzo di euro.
Investigators went through Monsignor Scarano's accounts at the Vatican Bank. In one of them, entitled Fund for the Elderly, they discovered millions of euros in alleged donations flowing in and out over the course of a decade. But very little of this money seemed to make its way to the old people of Salerno.
Monsignor Scarano riceve molti soldi, milioni di euro da parte di una famiglia di armatori Idamico che sono originari della sua stessa città Salerno e questo ovviamente è un dato. L'altro dato è che Idamico gestiscono un impero che ha società sparse in tutto il mondo e che alcuni di questi soldi, gran parte anzi di questi soldi che vanno a Scarano, provengono proprio da società offshore e le si vuole fare rientrare tramite la sponda dello IOR, che appunto permette di far rientrare in Italia o comunque nel sistema bancario europeo dei soldi senza che se ne abbia traccia della provenienza.
In very simple terms, here's one way you could launder money through the Vatican Bank. First, find a friend who has the right to open an account there. Next, with your friend, create a charity, let's say a foundation for penniless historians. Then open an account at the bank and donate your money. Because these are donations, who's going to question your intentions? Now comes the clever bit. The Vatican Bank has umbrella accounts with high street banks for its customers in Italy and abroad. Have your money moved into one of those. Provided the correspondent bank does not ask too many questions about a wire from the Pope's bank, there will be no way to trace the origins of the money, which you can then transfer into your personal account. Hey presto, the money is clean. Next, you can spend or invest your money as you will. Allegedly, Father 500 euros spent his on art and a luxury 17-room apartment.
One of the difficulties with the Vatican Bank is that it's a very different animal than a normal bank. I mean, in a normal bank, anybody walking in off the street who's got $10 can open an account. With the Vatican Bank, you've got to be a certain kind of entity. You've got to be a religious order, or you've got to be a diocese. You've got to have a right to have an account. Once you pass that scrutiny, then there's this kind of attitude in the Vatican Bank that now you're della familia, you're in the family. It's somehow inappropriate to be scrutinizing where you got your money or what the hell you're planning to do with it.
But all of this could soon be a thing of the past. Since 9/11, concerns about the financing of terrorism have made the fight against money laundering a worldwide priority. And Pope Francis has made it clear that decades of scandal have to come to an end. Following Scarano's arrest, the director of the Vatican Bank and his deputy left.
So the Vatican Bank over there is on the road to reform.
It was Benedict XVI who set change in motion in 2010. He passed the Vatican's first ever anti-money laundering law, created a financial watchdog, and before stepping down, named a new president at the Vatican Bank who started monitoring accounts. As a result, more than 100 suspicious transactions were identified in 2013, and a very special questionnaire was sent to all account holders. What the Vatican Bank wants to know is where the money comes from.
And this is not an easy sell. I mean, there are some old-timers in the Vatican, up to and including some cardinals, who have been deeply offended that the bank wants to know where they got their money and what they're doing with it.
Una delle ombre è sicuramente quella delle fondazioni, che possono coprire utilizzo, o meglio, flussi di denaro che non sono collegati alla loro origine, al loro scopo istituzionale, o addirittura fondazioni di fatto false.
But Pope Francis seems to mean business. He's appointed a new head of the financial watchdog and formed a commission to reform the Vatican's financial institutions. Oh, and he replaced all but one of the cardinals that sat on the board of the Vatican Bank.
Since Pope Francis has arrived, the feeling is that reforms have accelerated. The Vatican Bank has put up a website, and they have published an annual report, just like any financial institution. This is the first time that we actually see the numbers. We actually see where the money goes.
For all the trouble it has caused, the Vatican Bank is surprisingly small. It has about 19,000 clients, for whom it manages assets of only 6 billion euros. In 2012, it generated a profit of 86 million euros. But what it does with its profits reveals how important it is to the budget of the Holy See. to the Pope's mission, in other words. In 2012 alone, the bank gave His Holiness 55 million euros, enough to cover 20% of the Roman Curia's budget.
So in some sort of way, we can say that with these contributions, the Vatican Bank allows the Vatican to go on with its life, its administration.
Io non so come finirà lo IOR. Alcuni dicono che forse è meglio che sia una banca, altri che sia un fondo di aiuto, altri dicono chiuderlo. Ma se sentono queste voci, io non so. Io mi fido del lavoro delle persone, dello IOR, che stanno lavorando in questo. Anche della Commissione, no?
But transparency on St. Peter's Square is still elusive. Let's take a look at the Holy See's operating budget. In 2012, it showed income of about 250 million euros and expenditure of about 248 million, so with net earnings of 2 million euros, more or less. But these figures don't tell the full story and shed no light at all on the Vatican's assets. When people think about the Vatican's wealth, its artistic and architectural treasures tend to be the first things that come to mind.
But the Sistine Chapel and all of the wonderful sculptures and paintings in the Vatican museums can't be sold. Instead, what really makes the Pope rich is something much more prosaic: bricks and mortar.
With over 220,000 parishes around the globe, the Catholic Church obviously has lots of consecrated land. But that's just the start. The Pope might just be one of the biggest landlords in the world.
London's a magnet for international real estate investors, but I would never have expected to find the Catholic Church among them.
I'm in Mayfair, one of the most expensive areas in the city. The building I'm looking at was bought in 2006 for £15 million. It's now worth an estimated 25 million. Not a bad investment. Journalist David Lee discovered the identity of the owner.
When we started to look into this, we discovered, to our surprise, that through a network of companies, the Vatican was owning property worth millions of pounds in London.
So what trail did you follow between these buildings and the Vatican?
What we found out was that they were all registered in the name of a company called Grolux. When we went back into the archives, it turned out that Grolux, in turn, was connected through an intermediary company in New York with a Swiss company whose name was Profima.
Can you tell us more about Profima? What does it do?
Well, Profima appears to be a Swiss holding company which controls the Vatican's property assets in various countries in Europe. And there's no doubt that it is the Vatican's instrument by which it controls a property empire. It was a puzzle to us why the Vatican went to such lengths to apparently conceal its ownership of this property empire.
These are documents from back during the Second World War, and according to what's written here, Profima already looked very suspicious to the British government. What they thought was that the holding company was being used to disguise the money's real origins. In other words, an enemy country, fascist Italy. This is the man who gave the papacy the chance to become a global financial institution, Benito Mussolini. From the fall of the Roman Empire until 1870, the Pope ruled over central Italy. But when Italy was unified, he lost all that territory. Then in 1929, with the Lateran treaties, the Duce compensated the Vatican for what it had lost. He gave the Pope a huge sum, the equivalent of 1.5 billion euros today. According to historian John Pollard, this was the turning point in the Vatican's fortunes.
So what did Mussolini obtain from the Lateran Pacts, and what did the papacy obtain?
Mussolini obtained a great deal. He obtained recognition of Italy by the Vatican. It meant that henceforth there couldn't be no Catholic opposition to the fascist regime. It gave fascist Italy a great deal of prestige in the world. The Vatican now had its own independent, sovereign, territorial base. It now had a nest egg of money which it could invest in order to give it financial independence. From this point on, the Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican, was no longer poor. The Vatican was very lucky to find someone, Bernardino Nogara, a Milanese banker, who was a brilliant investment manager. So he developed a strategy of very, very big, very diverse portfolio, investing in gold, in currencies, and then in property.
Since then, the Vatican has become an international property giant. But Rome is where His Holiness has the most real estate. Maurizio Turco was the first to try and find out just how much. The endeavor would have tested the patience of Job.
Noi molto ingenuamente pensavamo che bastasse richiedere quello che era il codice attribuito agli enti ecclesiastici per avere tutto il listato degli immobili. Così non è stato. Quindi ci siamo messi a lavorare su una serie di nomi che avessero attinenza con i santi, le congregazioni, gli ordini, per poter avere un quadro abbastanza completo di coloro che possiedono degli immobili a Roma. Da lì siamo riusciti a individuare 24.000 immobili tra terreni e fabbricati nella città di Roma.
Come mai questo mistero?
Ma perché dietro ogni immobile ci dovrebbe essere una tassa da pagare, proprio la tassa sugli immobili. Per diversi anni gli immobili di proprietà di enti ecclesiastici sono stati esentati dal pagare le tasse, non sulla base dell'attività che veniva svolta all'interno dell'immobile, ma sulla titolarità, sulla proprietà di quell'immobile. Cioè se l'immobile è dell'ente ecclesiastico non paga le tasse, anche se si svolgono attività commerciali. Bastava una cappella all'interno del ristorante che fosse di proprietà di un ente ecclesiastico per non pagare le tasse.
Catholic restaurants and hotels. You aren't going to find many of them in most parts of the world. But in the Eternal City, they are everywhere, and they make a great deal of money. Staying in a good Catholic hotel could cost you €600 a night. From basic B&Bs to five-star palaces, in Rome and its surroundings, the church has 10,000 hotel beds that generate an income of €700 million a year.
Real estate generates revenue, of course, but in Italy, as elsewhere, can also be a formidable tool of power. It can be deployed to create bonds between clergymen on the one hand, and on the other, influential people inside the state.
Take the case of the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, also known as Propaganda Fide. Established in 1622, it is the Catholic Church's powerful evangelical arm. In the Rome area alone, the congregation owns over 1,100 properties.
Propaganda Fide fa derivare la sua grande forza dall'immenso patrimonio immobiliare. Solo in Italia il patrimonio immobiliare vale circa 10 miliardi di euro. Questa è la stima che si fa. Nel 2010 emersero molti fatti legati al patrimonio di Propaganda Fide, che veniva generalmente affittato a poco prezzo a politici, funzionari pubblici. È moneta di scambio.
The bargain sale of one of Propaganda Fide's buildings attracted the attention of investigators when they discovered that one of Silvio Berlusconi's government ministers was involved. Prosecutor Sergio Sottani led the investigation.
Propaganda Fide, proprietaria di questo palazzetto, aveva venduto questo immobile a una società il cui legale rappresentante era il figlio dell'allora ministro delle infrastrutture Lunardi. Il contratto prevedeva un corrispettivo per l'acquisto di questo immobile di circa 3 milioni di euro, ma a dire dell'architetto il valore dell'immobile era molto più alto, almeno 7-8 milioni di euro. Successivamente alla Procura di Perugia arrivò una documentazione che faceva riferimento a un finanziamento da Propaganda Fide per la realizzazione di un museo. C'era stato un intervento indiretto del ministro per sollecitare un'urgenza nella erogazione del finanziamento in favore di Propaganda Fide.
We'll never be able to find out whether the minister was corrupt or not. The Italian Parliament didn't authorize investigators to proceed with the inquiry, so the case was abandoned.
Quel procedimento si è chiuso per prescrizione, il che vuol dire che non si sono state fatte le indagini.
Seduta sospesa.
Gli interessi e le relazioni col Vaticano sono troppo importanti per lo Stato italiano per rinunciare a queste relazioni, per romperle addirittura con un'indagine per corruzione.
Giuda ha incominciato da peccatore avaro e finito nella corruzione. Quanto male fanno i corrotti nelle comunità cristiane. Peccatori sì, corrotti no.
Throughout its long history, the Church's relationship with political power has often proved financially rewarding. It's a pattern that started with the first Christian emperor of ancient Rome, Constantine.
L'impero inventa una soluzione straordinaria per manifestare il proprio consenso al cristianesimo, cioè con l'esenzione dalle tasse. Questo instilla l'idea che se la Chiesa riceve del denaro dallo Stato, poco o tanto che sia, questo è un bene perché è una garanzia materiale, pratica del fatto che c'è un atteggiamento di rispetto, e la paura di essere fuori da quest'area del rispetto qualche volta è stata pagata anche cara.
The Church's troubled relationship with money has had earth-shattering effects on Christianity in the past. At the beginning of the 16th century, Pope Leo X decided to grant a kind of first-class ticket to paradise to any sinner who helped pay the bill for constructing St. Peter's Basilica. Now, this trade in indulgences, as they were called, was what enraged Martin Luther and thus triggered the birth of Protestantism.
Selling these indulgences was a great cash business. Actually, the first advertising slogan in history was coined to promote the sale of indulgences. It was a Dominican preacher by the name of Johann Tetzel in the 12th century who went around telling people, when the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. And he had great success, raising money on that basis. But I think somewhere deep in the Catholic psychology is this notion that one of the ways to get right with God is to support the church.
People pay for masses, to have masses offered for their deceased. Why? Because having mass will help them get out of purgatory. I think there's still a mentality in the old folks like that. My grandmother, who's 93, that's what she does. She, instead of Christmas cards, she sends people a note, I'm having mass said for your husband. And, you know, it goes back also to the idea of indulgences.
The Sunday collection is a tradition as old as Christianity itself. And it's also a vital moment for the church's coffers.
With this weekly donation, Catholics contribute to their parish and its many initiatives. Anything from charity projects to the weekly newsletter. But not all the money stays at the local level. Parishes contribute part of their income to their bishop, who in turn sends a discretionary contribution to the Pope. In 2012, bishops sent over 26 million euros to St. Peter's Square.
But the money that worshippers put in the collection basket doesn't always end up where it's supposed to go.
Embezzlement of donations is one of the biggest issues facing the church around the world. In the USA, where Sunday collections yield a hefty $13 billion per year, it's reached record levels. Chuck Zeck has created a master's program in church management at Villanova University. He's taking me back to class.
How do you explain embezzlement?
That embezzlement equals need plus opportunity. 21% of the diocese told us they never audit their parishes. Well, there are some parishes, John, where the same person counts the collection money on Sunday, deposits the collection money, writes all the checks, and reconciles the checking account. They do every step of the way. A few years ago, a colleague of mine and I did a study. We found that 85% of the diocese had experienced an embezzlement in recent years, many more than one.
85% is absolutely systematic.
It is, yeah.
For instance, Kevin Gray, a Connecticut priest, stole $1 million to pay for male escorts and a luxurious lifestyle. Anita Collins, an office worker in the Archdiocese of New York, was charged with stealing over $1 million, which she spent on expensive dolls, among other things. Father Rodney Rodis from Virginia was sentenced to 63 months in jail after it was discovered that he'd stolen $600,000. He had a wife and 3 children.
No one would think that a priest would embezzle from the church. No one would think that a lay worker would embezzle from the church. So we don't put the kind of internal financial controls that are commonplace in the business world.
More than a failure to understand the principles of management, this sounds to me like a failure to understand human nature.
Se noi andiamo sulla strada delle ricchezze, se andiamo sulla strada della vanità, diventiamo lupi, no? Pastori. Pregate per questo.
When it comes to money, this is one of the sloppiest and most decentralized organizations on earth. I think in part that's because of the theology, which is that decisions about how to use financial resources should not be made by the central authority. They should be made at the local level. In part, it's because the church is led by people who are great experts in theology and liturgy, but sometimes have a grade school understanding of finance, and frankly, don't even know the questions to ask, let alone where to go to get the answers. The flip side of that is, of course, it opens the door to incredibly sloppy procedures and the possibility for real corruption.
Indeed, there's enough money in Catholic America to tempt a saint. In 2012, the Archdiocese of Chicago reported assets of $3.1 billion. The mind boggles. For the sake of comparison, that year the Cologne Archdiocese, the richest in Germany, reported assets of 166 million euros, so about 5% of its American cousin.
But the truth of it is, the real money in the Catholic Church in the United States is in what you might call the church outside the church. That is, all of these outfits that are Catholic but not under the direct control of the bishops.
There are 56 different Catholic healthcare systems in the United States. They spend close to $100 billion. There are 251 Catholic universities in the United States. The largest 10 alone spend something over $6 billion.
In this largely Protestant country, the Catholic dollar is a force to be reckoned with. Estimates put the financial footprint of the Holy Roman Church in the USA at a whopping $170 billion a year. Catholic healthcare networks account for 57% of that total, colleges 28%. While only 6% is accounted for by the day-to-day operations of parishes and dioceses, and charitable activities amount to just 2.7%. If the Catholic Church were a corporation, it would be among the top 20 in the USA, right up there with companies like General Motors and Apple.
I mean, this is one of the reasons, to be honest, politically, that I think the Vatican over the years has been so nervous about making sure that the American Catholic Church doesn't spin out of control. Because if it did, it's not just taking a pool of 70 million Catholics with it, it's taking an enormous set of financial resources with it that actually dwarf the money that the Vatican has control of.
But the Catholic Church in the USA did spin out of control when the biggest scandal in its history exploded. The cover-up of the sexual abuse by priests of thousands of children all over the country.
Priests rape boys. That's what we're here to tell you.
The impact on the victims, as on the church and its coffers, is still being felt today. Between 1994 and 2012, it's thought, $3.3 billion in compensation paid out to the victims. As a direct result, as of 2014, 10 American dioceses have gone bankrupt.
Now, one thing that happens when there are bankruptcy proceedings is an awful lot of paperwork gets generated, reams and reams of documentation. And it's that documentation that has taught us an awful lot that we didn't know before about the church and its money.
Patrick Wall is a former priest who has a unique perspective on how the church has handled the crisis.
As a Benedictine priest in the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis, I fill the role that is filled in every diocese around the country, around the world, literally, where there has to be somebody who is willing to follow a sex abuser. So when that abuser is pulled out just before any kind of public revelation, somebody has to go in and calm the waters and literally fix the problem.
Before it even comes to issues of compensation, abuse is a very expensive business for the church.
Well, when I sat on the Finance Council in St. Paul, the Archdiocese, there is a portion of the budget that takes care of all the clerical abuse issues, and that's the whole spectrum. Those guys that have to go to the various treatment facilities, those guys who have children, those things have to be paid for, but they have to be paid for on a generic payment number, so that no one really knows except for those people in the chancery and those priests who are actually negotiating those deals.
And how did this role of fixer within the Catholic Church in relation to the issue of child sexual abuse make you feel?
After my 5th assignment, with multiple cases, with both lay teachers and clerics having sexually abused, I got to see the spectrum that this is a long-term, multiple-century problem, that this is a financial problem that's handled by the black budget internally, and that this is not going to stop, and I chose to leave.
Patrick Wall went on to become a lawyer and joined Jeff Anderson, who's represented over 1,000 of the sexual abuse victims. Their attention these days is focused on Milwaukee, where 48 priests stand accused of abuse. But the scandal has become a financial one, and the lawyers have one man in particular in their sights: Timothy Dolan, Archbishop of Milwaukee from 2002 to 2009. They accuse him of burying diocesan money to avoid paying compensation to victims.
For over 2 decades, we've been working with survivors to force the disclosure of the documents they have kept secret. And recently, within the last 2 years, the court ordered the disclosure of the documents. And in 50,000 pages of documents, it was revealed to us that Archbishop Dolan got permission from the Vatican to move almost $60 million into the cemetery trust. Why would they move such an enormous amount of money into a cemetery trust fund that had already been self-sustaining? And so there's one singular reason why these transfers occurred: the decision of Archbishop Dolan to make sure that he and his diocese did not have to account to the survivors.
The smoking gun is a letter dated 4th of June 2007, in which Archbishop Dolan writes to the Vatican to request permission for a transfer.
The specific fund to be transferred is that which covers the perpetual care needs of the Catholic cemeteries owned and operated by the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. The transfer of these assets to the trust would bring with it the transfer of this same obligation and restriction. By transferring these assets to the trust,
I foresee an improved protection of these funds from any legal claim and liability.
Surely the Church, which does a lot of good in the community, has a right to protect its assets.
There's no question that the Roman Catholic Church has and does an enormous amount of good, but there's also no question that they have an enormous amount of power. And in order to preserve that power to do the good, they have committed and continue to commit systematic crimes to conceal what they've done to preserve their reputation. And it's in that context that at the same time they do good, they do evil and permit evil to occur.
This is the hat I want to put on the Empire State Building and the home plate at Yankee Stadium and the Statue of Liberty.
Archbishop Timothy Dolan is now Cardinal Dolan of New York, one of the richest dioceses in the USA. He vehemently denies the accusations.
Malarkey. The Archdiocese of Milwaukee has an excellent record of fiscal integrity and transparency. this lawyer's reckless charges also included hiding the cemetery fund, which of course by state law is scrupulously protected and cannot be touched or transferred by anybody. So these silly charges are baloney.
In Milwaukee, the wounds are still wide open and festering.
Very nice to meet you. Nice to meet you too. Welcome to Milwaukee.
As a child, Peter Isley was sexually assaulted by a priest over a period of 2 years.
They have spent millions and millions and millions of dollars here to not just cover up crimes, but to make sure that no survivor here virtually gets any help or compensation for what they've done. It's $11 million for lawyers. That's what's been spent. If you take a typical sex offender priest, let's say he's been in ministry for 25 years, let's say that he was identified as a child molester early on in that ministry, how much money do you think it costs to keep that priest salaried for all his lawyer expenses, for covering up everything that he was doing? Let's say it costs, being very conservative, $1 million to do that. $1 million. When some bishop, like Dolan or somebody else, says, the church is charity, that's what counts, we can't conduct our charity because of these lawsuits. Obviously, if you're willing to spend $1 million or more on some child molester because he's a priest, and you've thrown all that money out at him, well, clearly it's not about charity, is it?
In January 2011, the Milwaukee Archdiocese filed for bankruptcy. With 575 sexual abuse claims and legal fees topping $11 million, it's one of the largest and most contentious bankruptcies filed by any diocese in the United States. The issue of the cemetery fund is still unresolved.
Unfortunately, the church has a responsibility to be custodians of what it has, and bishops are doing all they can to preserve these funds. They've gone so far as to even not take responsibility for the actions of their priests. The problem becomes even more magnified by the fact that no bishop has been disciplined by the Holy See for mismanaging the sex abuse crisis and mismanaging the funds.
The issue of compensation for victims of child sexual abuse by priests has triggered a state-by-state legal battle over America's statute of limitations. What's at stake here simply is whether the abuse happened too long ago to be subject to legal proceedings. Now, if the church loses that battle, then it stands to have to pay out even more to the survivors. So that's why the church is now spending heavily on political lobbyists.
A survey has found that the US Conference of Catholic Bishops, the highest level of the church hierarchy, spent over $26.5 million in 2009 alone to shape public policy on religion-related issues.
In the United States alone, I think that, they say the Catholic Church is the largest denomination. Now, this is a country that has lots of different religions, and it's the largest denomination. Do you know what the second largest denomination is? Former Catholics, people who've left the Catholic Church. And why? Many of them say, oh, it's a wealthy organization, it's phony, it's all about money, which is unfair to a lot of the good people that, give their lives to helping their brothers and sisters in the works of charity and works of proclaiming the mercy and love of the gospel.
Il denaro è lo sterco del diavolo.
Do good, love your neighbor, look after the poor. These are some of the tenets of Catholicism that have convinced believers all over the world to donate money and buildings for the church's good works and art to proclaim its message.
Everywhere I've been, I've seen a church that's profoundly uneasy about accepting the dangers and responsibilities that inevitably come with managing wealth.
Pope Francis's answer has been to relaunch an inspiring vision of a poor church. But what does that actually mean?
Peter Turkson from Ghana is one of the most influential cardinals in the Vatican. He has one interpretation.
Do you think in his warnings about money and corruption and so on, he was also sending a message to the church itself?
So yes, the message is for also those within the church, but their own attitudes towards money and towards wealth, and how these can also compromise, the credibility of their own preaching of the gospel and their own ministry. So the message goes to all of us.
Pope Francis himself is setting an example. He's rejected many of the trappings of his office. He drives around in any old car, and he prefers a hotel room to the majesty of the apostolic palace.
Lui dice, nel momento in cui il prete fa bene il suo mestiere, il popolo lo aiuta. È il prete che va a cercare i poveri, che non aspetta, non è il signorotto locale, ma è al servizio dei fedeli, e quindi i soldi servono soltanto nella misura in cui rendono credibile la tua missione. Cioè, tu servi perché aiuti. Se non aiuti, il denaro diventa veramente un impedimento alla missione.
Pope Francis is perfectly aware that some of the symbolism of power in the Catholic Church turns people off. That is the gold and the scarlet and the lace that seem symbols of privilege rather than service, and he is actively trying to dial down a lot of that. And there is some proof that it's working. I was recently in a Roman restaurant, ran into a very veteran Vatican cardinal, a guy who usually looks the part, but now he dresses very simply. And when I jokingly asked him what was up, he looked at me and he said, "What you must understand is that with this Pope, simple is the new chic."
The pressure for change in the Catholic Church is acute. Scandal after scandal has weakened its authority, tarnished its reputation, and muddied its message.
Pope Francis is trying to put his house in order. He's opened the Vatican's accounts to scrutiny. He's cracking down on greed, avarice, and ostentation. But the road ahead could be rocky.
È chiaro che l'ardore e l'intensità della riforma alla quale Papa Francesco si accinge ha delle difficoltà, e riguardano il fatto che, toccando equilibri e cristallizzazioni di potere, ovviamente si fa degli amici ma anche qualche volta dei nemici, e il papato non è del tutto insensibile al clima che lo circonda.
If these reforms are going to take place, the Pope is going to need support. It's not real clear that there is a strong body of support behind him right now. He's thrown off a lot of people, not only in the Vatican.
Uno dei principali magistrati antimafia italiani, Gratteri, ha evidenziato il rischio di vita di Francesco, perché i clan della mafia, che erano abituati a riciclare i soldi attraverso lo IOR, non possono più farlo adesso perché c'è la trasparenza, la glasnost di Francesco, e quindi sono nervosi. Avendo perso una straordinaria lavanderia per il proprio denaro, proveniente dalla droga, da traffici illeciti, potrebbe pensare a un attentato a Francesco.
The Church is 2,000 years old. For Pope Francis to succeed in his reforms, then it will have to change faster than at almost any time in its history. However, at the end of this journey, I wonder whether the Church is not doomed to an eternal love-hate relationship with money.
It needs money to do what it wants to do in the world. If it wants to serve the poor, if it wants to say Mass, it has to have financial resources. So the Church has to pursue resources responsibly, and it has to manage them transparently, and yet it also has to make clear that it has a special love for the poor. Now, on its best days, that's a difficult balance to strike, and the truth of it is, the church is not always on its best days.
From a public relations point of view, promoting a poor church is a tremendously effective strategy. The crowds that Francis attracts prove it. But reform is one of those words. Like love and hope, everyone is for it. The hard part is to execute it. As popular as he is, if Pope Francis doesn't sort out the Catholic Church's money issues, almost nothing else in his papacy will matter.